So this was review week, my first wave of reviews for the new year. Wasn't really expecting to get a lot of comments, but I did. Some of which I feel were kind of worth addressing, or really this is a pretext for me to talk about trends in video games and what I think of them. So let's go ahead and get started. Let's start with Yield Fall of Rome. I had a few people on there who their response to the video was more or less, eh, and I can understand that. That's kind of my take on Yield and games like it. I mentioned, I think, as far as this kind of fast strategy, quick strategy game goes, whatever, I don't know if there's a name for it yet. As far as games like this go, I really prefer Hexarchy to Yield. Hexarchy was a game I looked at, I think, 2 years ago. But honestly, even that one is good, but it's not for me. And I think that's kind of my overall approach, because one person on here said that the issue here was just how short these games are, which, I mean, on the one hand is the point, but on the other hand, I kind of get it. I want to talk about this quick strategy trend, because clearly it's going to be a big thing, or at the very least, like 2K thinks it's going to be a big thing, because if you actually look at how Civilization 7 was designed, they're kind of trying to find a halfway point between like a conventional 4X game and this new quick strategy tabletop inspired trend. Because that's the only explanation I can have for their really weird decision to do this thing where when you get to the end of an era, you just transform into a different civilization that may or may not have any cultural or historical connection to the one you're currently playing. It doesn't make a lot of sense, like real world sense. But from a design perspective, you can kind of see what they're doing is they're taking a traditional campaign, which is 6 to 8 hours more or less for Civilization, and splitting it up so that each individual part of it is only about 2 hours. And you can also just pick one of them and just have it be a 2-hour game. So clearly, the Civ developers think that this is a trend that is going to grow because they're trying to split the difference between what they normally do and what's going on with these quick strategy games. And on one hand, I get it. I think quick strategy is kind of an extension of the short games trend in general that we've been seeing recently, where it to me feels like a reaction to what's been going on in the AAA space, in particular, some of the indies too, but especially these really big deal games are just getting so long. And for a long, long time, for decades, games, especially certain types of games, have been promoted largely on their length. But it's just gotten so extreme to the point where some of these, big deal A-tier games from the last few years, they have single-player campaigns running 200 to 300 hours. And to some people are like, yeah, awesome, lots of bang for my buck. And other people look at that and think, I don't want to commit 3 months of my life to a video game. And quick strategy is probably just a part of that. It's just a part of it that doesn't appeal to me personally because I don't mind if these games run long. I play Paradox games, for God's sake. I've read that if you do the grand campaign for Europa Universalis 4, which is the full game from, 1444 to 1821, if you do that, the minimum time to do a campaign, if you play it on the highest possible setting and never pause, still takes something like 13 hours, which nobody plays it like that. I think a practical length for a grand campaign is probably about 30 hours, and even that assumes you know what you're doing. So to me, I'm not put off by these games taking a long time to play. I'm fine with that, and as a result, these shorter ones can be a little bit disappointing. Now, for a while there, especially with games like Hexarchy and Yield, that I was kind of about. I thought maybe this just isn't for me in general, but I don't think that's necessarily true. So the game I'm using for the B-roll in this is Dawnmaker. And Dawnmaker is kind of in this category a little bit. It's a very different type of game because it's not like an obvious 4X. It is much more leaning into the tabletop aspect. It is still essentially a quick strategy game. And in fact, it's even structured very similarly to Yield, where you have an overall campaign with individual levels, and the levels are actually pretty short, but the overall campaign runs out to more or less Civ length. I think Dawnmaker, it's a little shorter. It's maybe 4 hours if you do everything right. But this one is not trying to be something else. Like, one of the issues I have with those other games is so many of them are trying to be like the 60-minute Civ. And I think that's restricting them. They're trying too hard to be something else, whereas with Dawnmaker is trying to be its own thing. And I think that's the issue. I feel this may end up being sort of where deck builders were, where you start off, everyone's just trying to be Slay the Spire, and then eventually people kind of, loosen up a little bit, and you start to see things like Astria come out. So, maybe in a few years this will be a little more interesting once these developers stop trying to be someone else. And speaking of developers trying to be someone else, here is a comment on Dead of Darkness review. I am decidedly not a nostalgia gamer, but I'm happy enough there are people out there making and playing these kinds of throwbacks, though I'm not sure we need quite so many. So let me give you my take on spiritual successors. I started doing reviews. The first review I wrote would have been in 2021. And at the time, most of the indie games that were getting any sort of press at all were those that were very clearly trying to look and feel like an older game. And it was really getting annoying, really starting to frustrate me, to the point where if I'm looking at a new game and anywhere in the copy I would see the phrase spiritual successor, I just immediately have a negative view of it. Not because those games were necessarily bad. Many of them were quite good, but there was a certain boring. It was just boring to look through it and just see all of these games that are trying to be something else and nothing trying to be innovative. Now, when I talk about innovation, I think there is room for people to rediscover older things, and that in a weird sort of sense is a sort of innovation. If there is some mechanic or some aesthetic or some design principle that's been lost for 35 years and someone brings it back, that is, in a sense, even though it's not brand new, is kind of innovative. Because more often than not, this is something that the powers that be declared dead ages ago. We're going to prove them wrong, and that is also a sort of out-of-the-box thinking. So I'm kind of fine with that. I've definitely cooled off on this, partially just because there aren't as many of them as there used to be. There are more people who are... They're chasing a trend rather than trying to turn into a specific game, which is progress. But when you are digging up these older ideas, you have to be careful because some of those ideas were lost for a reason. Speaking specifically about Dead of Darkness, which is, again, the game that this comment was on, the review, Dead of Darkness is, very inspired by old survival horror games, and the inventory is straight Resident Evil very clearly. It even looks like the Resident Evil interface, the old one. And I mentioned that annoyed me. Like, I feel like that's one of the weaker spots in that game, because you can't drop items. You have 8 inventory slots for everything. You can't drop items. So if you have to pick up a key item and your inventory is full, then you have to use something up. You have to, fire your gun empty to get rid of bullets. And if you can't do that, sometimes you have to, run back and find a box to store items, and that may be nowhere close, which is how you used to have to play Resident Evil games. I honestly do not understand, with all of the horrible, horrible design decisions they made in those old games, how that series ever took off. But in particular, when you're doing these throwback games, you are allowed to learn from the mistakes of some of those older developers. If I'm remembering correctly, they did not add the ability in the old Resident Evil games to just drop items until RE0, which, if I'm not mistaken, was the 5th game they made. And that's a really long time to figure out that that's a nice thing to have. But you're allowed to just look at that and look at those old games and realize, oh, it's really frustrating that you have to juggle your inventory all the time. It would be nice if you can just drop things you don't need, and you can have that. And, it's especially frustrating with that game because they did have the developers did put in a lot of these little quality of life things that were not in the old, Resident Evil or Alone in the Dark games, that make them much nicer to play, but you're still stuck with their awful inventory system.